We're heating things up today on the MIgardener channel. We're talking about heat mats. I hope you guys are going to enjoy this episode because in today's episode, we're going to talk all about heat mats. What seeds need them, what seeds don't, the temperatures that each seed could use, and some other tips about using these heat mats. Let's go. Heat mats can be a very beneficial tool, but to a lot of beginning gardeners can also be a reason why your plants struggle or even die. Heat mats should not be used under certain circumstances if a plant likes cool weather or germinates in cool soil. Also should not be used once seeds actually germinate. The problem is with heat mats is they don't really have the ability to regulate to an ideal soil temperature, whereas germination for some plants, as we'll get into, may be around 85, 90 degrees. That's great, but once they grow, they don't like that, and they might like something more like 60 to 70 degrees. I see a lot of gardeners making this mistake. Now they assume that this heat mat has radiant heat, which it does, but it only radiates very locally. It does not broadcast the heat out like, say, a space heater would. So this is going to warm a very specific area. That specific area is typically a 10-inch by 20-inch area. This is 10 inches by 20 inches. That's not just by luck. The reason why it's 10 inches by 20 inches is because that fits a very standard 10-20 tray. That gets its name from 10 inches by 20 inches. The greenhouse and garden center industry have really adopted this as a universal measurement to make things very modular and understandable when talking about flats. So you could have 100 cells in here, you could have 48, 72, it doesn't matter. It's whatever cells can fit into a 10 by 20 area. And so typically your heat mats are going to be 10 inches by 20 or 20 by 40, which would hold 2 flats. Do not, under any circumstances, take your tray and put it, perpendicular to the heat mat. This is going to create a hot spot and a cold spot where you're going to have very random and irregular germination. Keep it always parallel to your heat mat. The reason why a lot of gardeners do this is because they have 2 flats they want to germinate with, but they only have 1 heat mat. At that point, what I'd say to do is start early and do 1 heat mat at a time, because once your seeds germinate, you want to turn your heat mat off. Or take your heat mat that has your seedlings, all your seeds have germinated, just move it off the tray, take another tray and move it in its place with fresh seeds. So now we're going to go through some seeds that do not need a heat mat. The first one would be corn. The reason why is corn does like warm soil to germinate. However, corn does not do well when transplanted. So technically it would benefit from a heat mat, but it doesn't benefit from being transplanted. So these trays won't do it any good. So just keep it off a heat mat, and that way you're not going to have problems. Keep this one for when your soil warms up and plant it directly outside. You'll thank me later. Peas. Peas like cool soil. They like early spring, lots of moisture. They're really going to suffer if you put these on a heat mat. A lot of people think that because peas and other legumes tend to like warmer soil, that you should put them on a heat mat. The problem is peas are a cool soil crop. They like a nice cool soil. You do have lower germination because of that, but if you put them into warm soil, it's going to make them very leggy, very fast. They're going to stretch because of that heat, and you're going to end up with really subpar pea plants. Another plant that does not need a heat mat at all, and one you really shouldn't be starting indoors at all, are radishes. Radishes don't like the heat. They're a cool weather crop. They can tolerate temperatures 30, 35 degrees just fine. They'll germinate in about 45 degree soil temperatures. So unless you're growing in temperatures that are colder than 45 degrees, there's really no benefit from a heat mat on radishes. Same thing applies to mustard and spinach. These are 2 crops that, much like radishes, you can plant them out in super early season. They can tolerate cold weather. Soil temperatures of 35 or 40 degrees, they're going to do fine in. They're going to germinate just fine, and typically you're going to find they're going to do better. In warm soil, these crops will get leggy very fast. That means they stretch and they get stressed. You don't want them to do that. You want them to grow very slowly. And so in early season, I find putting these directly out in the garden is going to be your best bet. All right, so now we're going to get to crops that can benefit from a heat mat, but I'd recommend adding a heat buffer. I'll get into what that means right now. So a heat buffer can be applied in many different ways. I prefer to use cardboard because cardboard is great. We have these little cardboard sheets here, and what I can do is I can set them up basically like this. And I can even double them up if I really wanted to create an even larger air gap, so that when I take my tray and I sit it on top, it's not sitting right on top of the heat mat. I can do this through a whole sheet of cardboard cut. I can also do this with these little cardboard squares I've cut out, and they work really well, because what happens is it allows airflow to come underneath to where the contact is not direct. These seedling trays here are not sitting directly on the heat mat, so you're having some seepage of the heat. Some is getting lost, and that's wonderful, because for these next crops, you don't want 85 to 90 degree temperatures. These crops are carrots. Now carrots, I prefer to directly sow them in the ground, but in the early season, sometimes you can do a process called multi-sowing. We have a video on that, really cool, by the way. You put a couple seeds in each tray, get them started indoors, move them outside before they form a really large taproot, and they're gonna do better, because sometimes sprouting them in early season can be really finicky. Broccoli. Broccoli can tolerate about 65 to 70 degree temperatures. It does like cool weather though, so once they germinate, much like all the other stuff, as soon as they germinate, take them out of the heat. And sometimes even if you start them correctly at the right time, you can start them indoors, move them directly outdoors, and you don't have to do much transplanting, which is awesome. But these, they like it warm, they don't like it too hot. Asparagus. Now, asparagus is another one here. It can tolerate some warm weather. I prefer, in my opinion, right around 70, 75 degrees. I find really good success. Too warm though, and I find that they actually get really leggy really fast, and you don't end up with the healthiest asparagus seedlings to move out in the garden. Lettuce is one that all you guys ask me about, if you should use a heat mat or not. And lettuce actually kind of falls into what I consider to be that kind of middle ground. They like some warmth, they can tolerate some cool as well. So I've sometimes thrown them directly out into the garden, but I'm starting them early. If I want to get a few started for a very early harvest, I might start them indoors, but I'm gonna put them on a heat mat with a buffer so that it's around 60, 65 degrees or so. They're gonna do very well in those conditions. Much warmer than that, and they can start to kind of go to seed. They can start to grow a little too fast. Keeping their growth controlled and slow is the best way to have nice, non-bitter, very crisp, fully grown lettuce. These two right here, beans and artichoke, are a warm weather crop. I do appreciate a heat mat, but not more than about 75 degrees. These are kind of what you consider fringe crops. Like, they could probably tolerate a heat mat. The thing is, they grow very fast once they germinate. So these are ones that I actually prefer a little cooler, around 70, 75 degrees or so. Not quite, it still is gonna have a heat buffer on them. They're still gonna benefit from that heat mat, but I want slightly cooler soil, because they do germinate so fast and they grow so fast that I don't wanna run the risk of stressing them out because they sprout too fast and grow too fast. So I typically keep these right around 70, 75 degrees. They work out really well. And then the last two that I find kind of need some heat, but not a ton of heat, are your cilantro and your cabbage. Now cabbage, much like broccoli, you're gonna be right around 60, 65 degrees, totally fine. No more than about 70 degrees, because you don't want them growing too fast. But once they germinate, take that heat off, and they're gonna do fantastic. As far as cilantro goes, cilantro likes cool soil, but it can benefit from sprouting in some warmth. And then as soon as it germinates, move it directly outside. Don't keep it indoors. Cilantro does not like temperatures above 65 degrees. They actually, contrary to popular belief, like it cold. We grow them in early spring and late fall, and no other time than that. Otherwise, they go to seed and they get really soapy. All right, so the final bunch of crops here are what I consider your full blast crops. These are ones that you could take your tray, sit it right on your heat mat, direct contact. That's gonna be awesome. Now, I will say, this question comes up every single year. Luke, I have my lights on a timer. Should I turn my heat mat on a timer? No, under no circumstances should you ever have your heat mat on a timer. The reason why is when it turns off and on, you're gonna have that very wild swing in temperature that can actually mess up germination and cause really bad germination problems. You don't wanna do that. Second reason is, depending on how many of these heat mats you have running, they can sometimes pull a lot of power, and if your fuses or your circuit breakers are not rated for that much draw, you might find that flipping on and flipping off tends to wear them out a lot faster, and you're gonna have some electrical issues. So just keep them on or keep them off, but don't do the whole on-off timer thing. With your lights, that sometimes can be okay, depending on the type of lights you're running, but with your heat mats, I find because they are generating a lot of that heat, these are better off just staying on. So no timer for those. But these are ones here, these are crops where you can keep them on the heat until they germinate just fine. Things like basil, we're talking 75 to 85 degrees, they're gonna do wonderful. Cucumbers, 75 to 85 degrees, just fine. Watermelon, they will benefit from some heat, I'm telling you. They do well in about 80, 85 degrees. They are awesome, awesome when you put them on a heat mat. Peppers, they love the heat. Peppers are probably, I think, one of the most synonymous crops with a heat mat. If you think of using a heat mat, it's typically with peppers. I will say also, the hotter the pepper, the more Scoville unit the pepper has, the spicier it is, the more a heat mat can benefit. I have found that bell peppers don't typically need very warm soil. 75 to 80 degrees is fine. But if you get into something like a habanero or a ghost pepper or a boot jalokia, things like that, your really spicy, knock your socks off peppers, those ones will really benefit from 85 to even 90 degree soil. So having them on a heat mat can really help. Your squash here, this is just a candy roaster squash, but any squash can benefit. Pumpkins, anything, zucchini, squash, definitely benefits from that warm soil. But again, they grow really fast. So as soon as you see sprouts, get them off the heat. None of these are gonna benefit from soil that it's like 90 degrees when they're already growing. Okra. Okra's another one, really loves that warm soil. It'll germinate in like 4 to 6 days with a heat mat. The more warmth you can give it, to a certain extent, the better. More nightshade crops, more solanense crops. Tomatoes and tomatillos. These are both really gonna benefit from some heat. 80, 85 degrees, they're gonna do great. Eggplants, some more solanense crops, they're gonna do wonderful as well. You really wanna make sure that these get some warmth. These are a nice tropical, they grow in the tropics natively, so these are really gonna benefit from some heat. 80, 85 degrees, they're gonna do wonderful. Onions, I love growing onions with a heat mat because they take sometimes 2 to 3 weeks to germinate. If you could speed up the germination time, you're gonna have better germination rate. The longer a seed sets in the soil, the higher the chance of something going wrong. So I find that onions are one, they're a prime candidate for a heat mat. And then finally, sunflowers. Now I am someone that does not recommend starting sunflowers indoors. Sunflowers love warm soil, but in my experience, they grow so fast. You can start them indoors and move them outside because by then, you might only have them inside for a week or two, which is fine. But if you start them in like early March, mid-March, when you're starting your other stuff, they're gonna be flowering before you move them outside. So they do grow so fast. They do love that warm soil. Just pick and choose. Some of these seeds, you may find putting them directly outside is fine for you. Like okra, beans, sunflowers, I might put them directly out into the garden. That's typically what I do. Now I will also say that not every heat mat is going to be the same. Every heat mat will be different. Some will run hotter, some will run colder. It's really up to you to kind of mess with it and find where your heat mat falls. I find that my heat mat runs around 85 degrees, and that's fine for me. Your heat mat should never, under any circumstances, get warmer than 90 degrees. If it does, return it or throw it out. That becomes a very big problem, not only for your seeds, but also as a fire hazard. So don't ever, ever, ever let a heat mat get warmer than 90 degrees. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you all learned something new. If you did, make sure to hit a like. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. And also make sure to head over to MIgardener.com. We have so many seeds, just $2 a pack. We do free shipping on seed orders of $20 or more, and we'll definitely take care of you. So as always, this is Luke from the MIgardener channel, reminding you to grow bigger. Take care. Bye.